Our next speaker started her career in consulting, but was quickly captured by what she calls the wonderful world of cybersecurity. She started working for Luit just over 10 years ago, and as a cybersecurity consultant at first, then transitioned internally to the role of CISO in 21, first for the Netherlands and also for Belgium later on. Our speaker loves to meet people, loves to write, loves to use social media to talk about all kinds of topics. Her CISO contemplations articles on LinkedIn are really a great read. Last year, when she spoke at this conference about the lessons that she learned as a CISO, she had just transitioned to a new job at the Information Security Forum. This year marks yet another transition in her career. Last month, Esther became the Chief Security Advisor for the Netherlands at Microsoft. She's here to offer a critical perspective about how companies address cybersecurity in their annual reports, or really how they don't address it, since they often downplay it or omit it altogether. And she wants to provide us with the ammunition to challenge cybersecurity public reporting in our organization. Please welcome Esther Schagen-van Luit. Esther, I am looking for the clicker. I'm going to run to the back, get the clicker from the previous speaker, and run back. Clicker,
they stole my clicker.
Oh.
Well, I'm just going to get started without the clicker for now.
I'm running back on stage to give you the clicker, which apparently is here. My apologies. Esther Schagen-van Luit, please, another round of applause.
Good morning, one. Good to see you again. Last year I was here with a talk about knowledge on cybersecurity in boards. This year we're going to be doing more exciting board governance stuff. As security professionals, we are very, very used to thinking about the security of our organizations, the data, the people, the processes in our organization. But how often do we think about the cybersecurity risks to ourselves, to our personal safety, to the safety of our loved ones? How about if cybersecurity risks materialize and flood our houses? Make sure that phone services no longer work or lead to plundering in supermarkets. How about that? In the Netherlands, we came dangerously close to that in 2021, where we didn't have cheese for a week. In 2021, we had the cheese hack, and one of the major suppliers of the Albert Heijn got ransomware, and they were unable to deliver cheese to our supermarkets. This seems like a small-scale problem, but I guess what I'm trying to say is how cybersecurity, and particularly long-term ransomware, can have a significant effect on our society and on our experience as citizens. Last year, when I was speaking here, I was doing a board studies called Blikverruimers, meant for young people who want to be in a supervisory board. And one of the things that I did there was read some annual reports. And I happened to read one that really surprised me a lot. So it was quite short, the section that it had. It was a very big organization here in the Netherlands. It had 3 lines on cybersecurity. And then it said things like, what are we doing about cybersecurity? We have SLAs with suppliers. And I was like, that's great. I sure do hope we have SLAs with suppliers. That seems like a thing we should all be having. We've got firewalls. Awesome. What does that mean? Didn't we have firewalls currently? Are you getting new firewalls, better firewalls? And we have a process with regards to granting system access. I sure hope you have one, because that seems like basic cybersecurity stuff to me. So that made me rather sad. Very sad indeed. And that triggered, so sometimes my anger triggers a talk, that triggered for me that I wanted to do an investigation into the state of cybersecurity reporting in the Netherlands. So today I will be covering that state of major organizations in the Netherlands that I deem part of vital infrastructure with you. We'll be looking at some best practices internationally, and then also I hope to round off with some takeaways that you can bring back to your organization in case they have flimsy cybersecurity reporting, to really see that improve. Because I think we as citizens have a right to know how major organizations in the Netherlands, part of our vital infrastructure, are keeping our safety secure. First, looking at our own Dutch corporate governance code. So in the 2022 edition, there is something mentioned on cybersecurity, which is a good step forward. There's 2 sections talking about cybersecurity. One is Principle 1.1, which talks about sustainable long-term value creation. And this basically means that apart from looking at just the financial results in the short term, organizations also have a responsibility to reflect and report upon what they see as long-term value creation, and the development of new technologies and things like cybersecurity should be covered in that evaluation. As you can see from the text, it is quite loose in terms of how it specifies that it should be covered, which also explains, and we'll cover that later, the diversity of reporting that we see in this in practice. The second part of the Dutch Corporate Governance Code talking about this is risk management, where the management board has a responsibility to identify and analyze the risks associated with the company. They're involved in setting the risk appetite and also having an opinion about the measures that are used to deal with those risks. And then in the example section of that code, it talks about a number of risks for which they should be doing that, amongst which cybersecurity. So that is all that we are specifying to organizations that they should be covering in terms of their reporting. I personally think that this is still quite loose, and we would benefit from having a little bit more, a few more demands in terms of what they should be saying exactly when it comes to cybersecurity. But let's dive into that a little bit more. So I took the very, very fun quest to review the Dutch annual reports from 2023. And since we have a lot of beautiful organizations here in the Netherlands, I had to make a selection. So I started off by looking at the 100 largest organizations in the Netherlands according to management scope. And then my first selection was to determine which of these would fall under NIS2 and DORA, as we can argue with each other that those organizations play a vital role in the societal fabric of the Netherlands. I did feel 67 reports was still a lot of reading. So what I did was look at the definition that our Dutch government has in terms of what organizations they consider to be part of vital processes. And of these companies, so that was 26, of these companies there were 10 listed at a stock exchange and 60 non-listed, which I thought would deliver an interesting difference maybe in the way that they reported on their cybersecurity risks and posture. What we're of course missing here, so this set of organizations is great in terms of that they are a vital part of our societal fabric. What we don't have an annual report of is, of course, our government. So talking about institutions like Rijkswaterstaat, Defensie, the police, for obvious reasons, if they were to have a sustained outage, that would be really, really problematic. But since there's no annual report, that is not in scope of this research. And so this is what I found. First of all, 92% of the organizations I review had an annual report, which seems self-evident, but apparently it's not. The others had something called a sustainability report. I felt this was an interesting difference, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Fortunately, 100% of the organizations and their reports mention cyber information security. So that is really good and is in line with the Dutch governance code. And then 85% of the reports listed cybersecurity as a material risk. Those that did not list cybersecurity as a material risk had an interesting, there were basically 2 camps. One of those was, we kind of forgot about it or we don't care about it. It was the feeling I got from the report. And then there were also organizations who said, well, it used to be a material risk, but we looked at it again this year and we don't think it's material anymore, which I think is interesting considering where I feel the state of the cybersecurity industry is going. Then 42% of the reports covered cybersecurity more in one page. So originally I thought I would give you a word count and then compare that, but that I found that the quality of the reporting and how effective they are with the words used kind of differs a lot. So some reports contain a lot of waffle, and I wasn't about to reward those people for just having a lot of waffle. But basically there's again 2 camps. There are the reports that have a tiny paragraph, a single paragraph covering information security. And then there are the reports that really have cybersecurity woven through the entire report, so a much more comprehensive approach. Only 35% made that step that I was interested in. So you are an organization in a vital process with a big societal responsibility, and unfortunately only 35% of the organizations had an explicit reference in their report that they were aware of the vital role that they play in the Netherlands, in our society functioning as it should, which I would love to see a little bit more improved. And then lastly, only 19% of the reports featured any kinds of metrics. And when I say any kind, usually that's 1 or 2, not 10, not 16. So I feel here there's also a lot of progress, and I want to be having a quick look at what some of the metrics were that were in there. Because many of the discussions I have with people on this is that they say, well, I don't want to write a lot in my report. Because, you know, as soon as I mention any of my vulnerabilities or weaknesses that I might have, it's going to make me a target. Hackers are going to find me and are going to attack me because I was transparent in my annual report. First of all, I'd love to believe that hackers are more inventive than opening their annual report of an organization as the first strategy for attacking someone. And secondly, as some of the organizations proved that I studied, you can write a lot of things about cybersecurity that provides information on how you're doing without putting a giant target on your back. So I'd like us to step away from that notion that putting anything interesting in an annual report is dangerous. And I'd love to step away from that security by obscurity. We're giving the people 3 lines of nonsense. Because that's how I felt when I read that original report during my studies. I was like, you could have not put it in. It's not telling me anything about how your cybersecurity is doing. So why even put it in there? To be fair, I also know, having been the CISO of Deloitte, that, you know, as a CISO, you write a piece, what you feel is interesting in a report, and then it goes through 16 layers of governance and marketing and PR, and God knows what comes out at the other end of it before it goes into the report. So that is something else that I want to be forgiving about with the organizations that I've reviewed. But then again, I think we should be writing interesting things in the annual report about cybersecurity. I also broke this down versus the listed and the non-listed companies. So for the annual report, 100% of the listed companies had an annual report, and those with the sustainability report were in the non-listed bucket. Then looking at material risk, so material risk was 100% for the listed companies and 75% for the non-listed. Again, what you'd expect, basically. In terms of the coverage, so you see that the listed companies, 70% of those had more than 1 page. So there it seems to be a more important risk to be covering extensively, whereas only 25% for non-listed. Business continuity, not a big difference. So 40% for the listed companies and 31% for the non-listed. And lastly, 30% of the listed companies had metrics in their report versus only 12% for the non-listed. So again, here it seems a little bit more common to maybe help investors understand cybersecurity risk by putting some metrics in the report. So what are some of these metrics used in the report? And we'll go through this quite quickly, but I felt it was really interesting to just put these in a list to see what kind of things organizations are already reporting and see if that's a fit for your organization. So first of all, some of the harder metrics. You'll see a lot of data breach, the number of data breaches, the number of privacy incidents, and the number of privacy incidents reported to the Data Protection Authority. That was quite normal. Phishing tests executed, a number of penetration tests executed were an interesting one, because I don't think that number is telling me a lot. I mean, it's telling me that they are happening, which is good. We like that, but the sheer number of penetration tests is not going to give me any level of comfort, I feel. The number of security events investigated was an interesting one. That just felt like bragging to me. Like, okay, I got thousands of security events that we're looking at with a SOC. Again, I'm happy to know you have a SOC. That's great. I'm just not sure what to do with that number of events. And then the last 2 are quite interesting. The number of contracts terminated over fraud or insider risk, and the complaints concerning breaches of customer privacy or loss of customer data. I felt this was quite a very transparent metric. Particularly the contracts felt a little bit sensitive and close to home to me. And then more relative, like percentages, the percentage of service availability, which I think is a logical metric to be putting in there. The percentage of users who completed awareness training was also a very common one. And then the next two are quite interesting. So customers using a security enhanced version of the product, as in the organization had taken it upon themselves to move their customers from their current version of the product to a more secure version, and that was a metric that they were tracking. And the number of technical employees that had gone through a security certification. And the last two are interesting with regards to that business continuity societal awareness element I spoke about. So percentage of the Dutch population that believes their data is safe at the company does show some awareness that they think it's important what people think of them. And then the percentage of disclosures of information on law enforcement requests is also a very interesting one, I feel. Some more metrics, and these are a little bit more out there. The certification and compliance status, so your ISOs, your SOC 2s, putting that into the report. One organization had their internet.nl website domain score in there, which I thought was a really interesting metric to be tracking. I suppose if it was quite low, you wouldn't want to put that in the report. But maybe that's an incentive to make sure that the score is really, really good. Then we've got increase in network and assets supporting the reliability. So going back to that business continuity point, this is an interesting one, as the organization is working on making sure that the network is more reliable, more redundant. Time spent on cybersecurity in board sessions is a tricky one. So I feel it's very important that the board spends time discussing it, but we don't know what they've discussed. So for instance, if they spend hours talking about how the CISO is not going to get budget for a security project, then that contributes to this metric, but it's not a great thing for security. I also feel that probably there's a lot of time here spent on PE sessions, like knowledge training, which is also good, but maybe not saying too much about how much attention the board has on cybersecurity in their organization. Then we come to some more business-like metrics, so the financial materiality, impact materiality, and the impact of risk on the value chain, all really good things in terms of giving investors more of an idea of what's happening in terms of the cybersecurity risk of that organization. And then the significance of financial impact of breaches occurred. So I only found this for organizations who were proud to say that they had 0 breaches and a 0 financial impact. I wonder if that metric would still be there if they had a significant breach with a significant impact. And the last one, monetary losses as a result of legal proceedings regarding customer privacy. Again, this one was 0 for this particular organization, but an interesting metric to be tracking. What I missed, some things that I missed, I'm sure you're missing a whole lot of other things as well, but what I think would be interesting with that view as to what I, as a citizen, would like to know is the budget invested in cybersecurity and year-on-year changes. So if a CISO has 20% less budget this year than they had last year, I would love to know what's happening there and whether that is a good thing for the organization. I would be interested to learn about the reduction of attack surface. So of course, I understand we can't say a lot about how many vulnerabilities are open, average time to patch, but maybe this would be an interesting metric to demonstrate that the organization is becoming more secure over time. And then audit results. I don't expect the actual audit results to be in there, but maybe something about we didn't have any critical findings this year, or we had these findings and we remediated those within 6 months. Something like that I felt would be useful, rather than just saying we are ISO 27001 certified. Thank you. Supply chain risks. So surprisingly, very little of these organizations mentioned their supply chain and what control they were exercising over the risks in those third parties, which I feel is critical if we're talking about vital infrastructure. BCM test results, just to see how people get back started up, how often they test, how well it went, and maybe anything around the completion percentage of a maturity program. So many of these reports will have some kind of waffle about, we're doing a lot of things and we're making it better and it's getting really, really good now. But it's very, very soft. So anything that I think we can do there to say maybe a timeline, a completing percentage, that we give people a sense of what they're actually doing, at which speed, how much investment is going in there, that I think would be a great thing to do. And what I purely want to demonstrate is these are quite a few metrics, and you might not agree with half of those. But going back to that initial report where there were 3 lines of nonsense, I think there's a lot of things that we could be reporting without threatening our own security as an organization, and still providing some more tangible information of what is happening in our organization in terms of security. And then I wanted to have a look at what audit geography is required, because we had a look at the Dutch Corporate Governance Code, and that was kind of loose, right? So I was very interested to see what the other organizations or the other geographies were requiring. I looked at Japan, Canada, Australia, the UK, EU, and the USA. I looked at corporate governance codes and some of the regulations to see what they were coming up with, and then divided that into a couple of buckets, which I will take you through now. So first of all, governance. Some of the metrics or ideas that were put forward by these codes were to talk about the description of the board governance setup. How are they looking at cybersecurity in the first place? The role of the audit and risk committee in the organization and how they tackle cybersecurity. The establishment of the security policy house and how that is being maintained to ensure that it's still up to date and fit for purpose for the organization. And then lastly, the continuous improvement process. Looking at the risk management bucket, disclosure of material risk, which we are seeing a lot, but what we are seeing is that they mostly say that it's just cybersecurity, one big black box. There's no further definition within that atmosphere what the individual risks are that the organization is tackling. Then high-risk data privacy impact assessments, the rigor of the risk assessment and management process, and a description of how those sub-risks that I mentioned are effectively managed in the organization. In terms of the effectiveness of controls, some of these codes required a management assessment of the internal controls, which I think you could take very, very narrow or very, very broad. The testing results of incident response plans, reflection on the ability to restore operations swiftly, and effectiveness of monitoring and response capabilities. To me personally, this already feels a bit more sensitive, so here I feel like, oh, this might be revealing a lot of information to attackers that could be useful for them, but I do also understand that these codes would like to see any kind of assertion on the effectiveness of detection, response, and restoration. Then we've got training and awareness. So, like I said, last year I spoke about doing that for boards. And indeed, there is a requirement of the assessment of board knowledge and skills with regards to cybersecurity. And of course, the training and awareness results of your security awareness program, plus the incorporation of threat intelligence to make sure that it is up to date what you're offering to employees. Then looking at business impact analysis. So these are some of the metrics or requirements that speak more to the organization and how they're dealing with cybersecurity. So we've got the impact of cybersecurity risk on investment risk there, particularly interesting for investors. We've got the impact of basically the incident response processes and what's happening there on the financial conditions, the result of operations, and the organization's liquidity. And we've got a description of how cybersecurity risks and what's happening there is affecting product services, relationship to customers and third parties. And lastly, the impact of cybersecurity results on the company's financial results. So these are really more the business-oriented metrics. But, you know, we have a lot of organizations have conversations around, oh, what metrics should I be giving to my board? They don't understand any of the metrics that I'm putting forward. Maybe these are some of the metrics that they'd actually like to know. So maybe if we flip that around, rather than saying what should we as CISOs be bringing to the board, we should be asking ourselves, what are the things that the board would love to know from us, from the CISOs, from the security professionals? Because these are some of the things that corporate governance codes around the world are asking from them to put into annual reports. And the fact that the Netherlands seems to be a bit more loose in terms of requiring that doesn't mean that this isn't a great metric for them to be having and tracking. Then we've got the disclosure of incidents, so the number of significant cybersecurity incidents, and then the privacy incidents we already spoke about. And lastly, compliance. So a reflection on how GDPR compliance is achieved internally and with third parties, and the audit results I mentioned before. So as you can see, this is a lot more that we are currently looking at in the Netherlands, which might explain some of the diversity that we are realistically seeing in those reports. What I think good looks like, and I start smiling again, is I'd love to see in these reports who's responsible for what in the organization. So just look at the 3 lines of defense. Who's doing what? Is the CISO owning all of the domains? Are these domains somewhere else? I think that would be good for people to understand how security is organized in your organization. Then what I mentioned with cybersecurity as a black box, I'd love to see it broken down into organization-specific risk and attack vectors to the level you feel is still safe. But I don't think we are helped by saying we have a cybersecurity risk. That is not telling me anything about how severe your risk is, what you're doing about it. So I'd love to see that broken down a little bit more. And then breakdown of specific risks within the cyber domain. So not just saying we're having a program. No, what are you doing on each of the domains that we're interested in? The why of the security strategy and the improvement program. So many of these reports will say we're having a program, and I'm asking why? Why do you have a program? Why? Do you have bad security maturity? Do you feel it needs to be better? Why are you doing this? That's what I want to know. And here, and this will be the only part where I mention Microsoft. So as you know, Microsoft has a Secure Future initiative, which is our internal security program that we've now made much more public after Midnight Blizzard. So I think last week or the week before that, we published a progress report on SFI, and that is 25 pages. It's 25 pages covering the progress in our internal security improvement program. So how come organizations think they cannot be writing more than 3 lines in their annual report, while Microsoft is publishing 25 pages? I'm just trying to say there's a lot more things that we can do in terms of describing that without putting a target on our backs. What I also noted was there was a big difference between security throughout the report versus one isolated paragraph. We had security as part of social responsibility and SDG targets. So this was really nice on the one hand because that goes back to the point that I'm making. You have a societal role to play as an organization. And so I'd love to see it tied into your corporate social responsibility. Then we also saw some organizations that have security as a product or a feature that customers actually desire, or security as an enabler of digital innovation. So people were actually calling out security and how it was helping them achieve their business goals. And then what I loved as well is that some organizations actually set targets for next year and then showed year-on-year metrics on how they were doing in terms of achieving those targets. I think that is something we can all do. But what we need to move away from is that many of these organizations, when it comes to their business impact, say something like, yeah, it would be really terrible for us because we lose money and our reputation is hurt, and we don't want any of that. Many of them really don't mention the societal impact that a breach could have, and that is what I'd love to see. So I'd love to see some reflection on, okay, what happens if we are not able to operate as we should for a week? What happens in society? How do we plan for that? How do we take our social responsibility into that? So what I'd like to end with, and that is my call to action to you, is I think we've seen a lot of things today that could potentially go into a report like this. But I also realize that we are security professionals, and maybe many of you have never opened their annual report. So if you could do that, if you could go away and open the annual report of your organization and form an opinion about whether you think it's good, interesting, it should be more extensive, you're getting actually useful information from that, I think that would be a great, great step. Then I think we can go ahead and we can influence our CISOs and boards on how we can be more transparent in cybersecurity in these annual reports. And lastly, I think there might also be a role for policymakers, as what you saw was quite loose in terms of what we specified organizations should be doing, and it would be helpful to maybe put forward more stringent rules on what we expect on reporting. Because we citizens have a right to know our cheese is protected. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Esther, for your wonderful presentation. I see we have 2 minutes left for questions because you started a bit earlier. Are there any questions for Esther in this audience before we go to the break in 2 minutes? If you still dare to.
I have one question.
Oh.
If you were CISO of CISOs, let's say, and you had carte blanche to spend your money on anything you want, but it had to be one thing, where would you invest the money in a cybersecurity program?
Carte blanche, where would you
blanche.
invest?
I've been a consultant, and so I should say it depends. It depends on the organization, I guess, and where they are currently. This is not an entertaining answer. I mean, if we assume that breach is going to happen at some point, and I'd had a decent set of preventative controls, then maybe I would invest it in detection and response and making sure I'm ready to tackle a breach when it happens. And, well, if I didn't take the topic of this particular session, is that I'd love to see a good plan for what happens for a sustained outage, and that organizations are able to take their role in society. And for instance, if I'm a very large supermarket and I am not able to get people food for an entire week, then we've got some other supermarkets, but still I think it's going to cause some chaos. And I'd love to see more thinking and reflection on what happens in that case and what the responsibility is of the organization, even if they're out, in terms of making sure that we do not all have no cheese for an entire week.
Thank you. Another round of applause. Esther Schagen-van Luit. Thank you. Thank you.